5 in the morning and the privy chamber is already alive with movement. The rushes on the floor have not yet been changed, and they carry the smell of the night before, candle smoke and cold ash and something sharper underneath, the particular staleness of a room that has been sealed for hours against the English autumn. A single candle burns near the door. The others have not yet been lit. The woman entering now is not a servant in the way we might imagine servants. She is a gentlewoman, the daughter of a family with a name and a history, educated in French and needlework and the correct angle at which to hold her head when royalty speaks. She has risen before dawn, not because she was ordered to, in the crude sense of the word, but because her position demands it, because the machinery of the English court requires her presence before the Queen opens her eyes, and because failing to appear at the correct hour would be noticed in ways that cannot easily be undone. She is one of the women of the bedchamber, and her entire world, her income, her social standing, her proximity to power, hangs on her ability to perform this morning ritual without error. The year is somewhere in the long middle of Elizabeth's reign, the 1570s or 1580s, a period when England is still defining itself against the Catholic continent, when the Queen's unmarried status is simultaneously a political masterstroke and a source of constant diplomatic anxiety, and when the court at Whitehall or Greenwich or Hampton Court, depending on the season and the Queen's mood, is the most concentrated place of power in the entire kingdom. Every room in that court is a stage, every gesture is a language, and the bedchamber, the most private room in a palace that has almost no real privacy, is the most loaded stage of all. What actually happened in Elizabeth's bedchamber before the court came to life? What did the women who served her most intimately see, and what did they later reveal? What did the Queen eat, wear, refuse, demand and discard before a single ambassador had been granted an audience? What did the room smell like, feel like, look like in the grey light before the performance of queenship began? And what did the habits of one woman's most private hours tell us about the nature of power itself in 16th century England? The answers are in the details, and the details are stranger and more human than the official portraits have ever been willing to show. If you are finding yourself already drawn into this world, take a moment to like this video. It helps this channel reach more people, and if you want more stories like this one about the real lives behind the history you thought you knew, subscribing takes 1 second and means you will not miss what comes next. Now, back to the chamber where Elizabeth's morning is just beginning. The bedchamber of an Elizabethan queen was not a private space in any sense we would recognize today. It was, paradoxically, one of the most politically significant rooms in England, and access to it was carefully regulated, fiercely desired, and used as a tool of governance in ways that sound almost incomprehensible now. The women who attended Elizabeth in that room were not chosen for their kindness or their efficiency. They were chosen because their families mattered, because their loyalty had been tested, and because keeping powerful noblewomen close and under obligation was a far safer political strategy than leaving them at large in the countryside where they might breed discontent. The bedchamber was, among other things, a gilded cage, and its occupants on both sides of the relationship understood this perfectly. What the maids and gentlewomen who served in that room left behind in their letters, their diaries, and the accounts that circulated quietly through the court provides a picture of Elizabeth that is almost shockingly different from the composed, luminous icon of the Armada portraits. The Queen who emerges from those private accounts is not a symbol. She is a body with specific needs, specific aversions, specific habits that appalled some of her attendants and confounded others, and specific vulnerabilities that she guarded with the same ferocity she brought to every other dimension of her reign. The morning began with what was called the levee, the formal rising, though calling it formal barely captures the elaborate choreography that governed every step. Before Elizabeth was dressed, before she was fed, before she spoke a word of politics to anyone, a series of preparatory acts had to be completed by the correct women in the correct order. The great bed itself, which in the royal palaces was a piece of furniture of staggering complexity, hung with silk and velvet curtains that could seal the sleeping body entirely from the rest of the room, had to be opened in a specific way. The curtains were drawn back by the senior woman present. The other women waited. Nobody spoke above a murmur unless the Queen spoke first. What those women saw when the curtains opened was not always the composed, regal figure the court expected to project. Elizabeth slept in a cap, as almost all people of the era did, because the rooms were cold even with fires burning, and the head was considered particularly vulnerable to the night vapors that 16th century medical thinking took extremely seriously. The caps worn by the Queen were fine, made of linen or silk, embroidered with small flowers or geometric patterns, but they were sleeping caps nonetheless, and they did not survive the night in perfect condition. Hair escaped them. The cap twisted. The Queen, by morning, could look startlingly undone, and the women whose job it was to manage this transformation from sleeping body to public monarch had to accomplish it efficiently and without expression. The teeth were a particular subject. Elizabeth had famous trouble with her teeth, a problem that worsened as she aged and that was directly connected to the sugar consumption that was one of the great status symbols of the Tudor court. Sugar in the 16th century was expensive enough to be a luxury, and eating it conspicuously was a way of displaying wealth. The Queen ate it regularly and at high volume, in the form of sweet wines, fruit preserves, marzipan, and the elaborate sugar sculptures called subtleties that appeared at great banquets as centerpieces that were then consumed. The results were visible and, according to several accounts that circulated among foreign ambassadors and courtiers, confronting. By the 1590s, her teeth were described by the German traveller Paul Hentzner as black, a condition he attributed specifically to the English habit of eating too much sugar. An attendant who served her through that decade noted privately that the process of cleaning the royal teeth each morning was not a procedure anyone undertook without steeling themselves first. The breath that accompanied those teeth was, by multiple accounts, something that required management. The women of the bedchamber used small bundles of herbs and aromatic preparations to counter the morning air of the room and the specific challenges presented by a monarch whose dental situation was deteriorating steadily beneath the heavy white lead makeup that served a different but equally pointed cosmetic purpose. That makeup, the ceruse that Elizabeth used in quantities that increased as she aged, and as the smallpox scars from her illness in 1562 required more consistent covering, was itself a slow and methodical daily process that the bedchamber women administered, and that represents one of the most genuinely disturbing aspects of royal personal care in the period. Ceruse was lead white, ground white, lead mixed with vinegar, to produce a thick paste that when applied to the face gave the smooth, pale, almost luminous appearance that appears in the later portraits, and that was deeply fashionable among aristocratic women of the era. The problem, which was understood in a vague way even at the time, and is understood with perfect clarity now, is that lead is a poison. Applied to the skin daily over decades, it absorbs into the body, it damages the nerves, it causes hair loss, which creates a need for more elaborate head coverings and eventually wigs, which Elizabeth wore extensively in her later years and which required their own careful management each morning. It causes the skin to deteriorate, which requires more ceruse to cover the deterioration, which causes more damage. A cycle that several historians of Tudor medicine have described as a slow, self-administered poisoning undertaken entirely in the service of a beauty standard that was itself a political requirement. The women who applied this makeup each morning were doing something that looks, from a distance of 400 years, almost unbearably intimate and almost unbearably strange. They were painting a face onto a queen. They were constructing the surface of power with their hands, smoothing the white paste over skin that had aged and marked and scarred beneath it, adding the red for the cheeks and lips that contrasted with the white to produce the particular palette of Elizabethan queenship. They did this in silence or in the quiet conversation that long proximity allows, And they did it knowing that the face they were building was not the face in front of them, but the face that England needed to see. The hair was, if anything, more complex. Elizabeth's own hair, which had been red in her youth and had thinned and faded significantly by her 40s, was increasingly supplemented and then replaced by the elaborate wigs she wore throughout her later reign. She owned over 80 wigs by some estimates, varying in colour, in style, and in the way they were constructed to signal different moods or occasions. The women who managed this collection, who fitted each one, who cleaned and dressed and stored them, occupied a very particular position in the domestic economy of the court. They knew something about the Queen that most of the court was carefully not allowed to acknowledge, that the hair visible in public, the red hair that connected her iconographically to her father Henry VIII, and to the vigour and legitimacy that colour implied, was not in any literal sense her own hair. This was not a secret in the modern sense. It was one of the many truths that the court had collectively agreed to unsee, and maintaining that collective unseen was part of the invisible labour of the bedchamber women. The smells of the bedchamber were complicated. The court, and this is where the story takes a turn, that the official histories prefer to leave undescribed, didn't bathe in the way we understand bathing. Elizabeth is often cited as relatively progressive in this regard, with accounts suggesting she bathed monthly whether she needed it or not, a phrase that appears in several sources and that functioned then as a mild boast rather than the punchline it sounds like today. In the context of the 16th century, monthly bathing was genuinely more frequent than the practice of many people around her. Full immersion in a bath was considered potentially dangerous by the medical thinking of the period, which held that warm water opened the pores and allowed disease to enter the body more easily. This belief had practical consequences that accumulated day by day in a room shared by a queen and her attendants. Between baths, the body was managed by dry methods. Linen played a central role. The finest linen undergarments that Elizabeth wore next to her skin were changed frequently, often daily for a woman of her means, because linen was understood to absorb sweat and odour from the body in a way that cleaned more effectively than water. Changing your linen was, in the 16th century, the equivalent of washing. The more linen you owned and changed, the cleaner you were considered to be, and Elizabeth's laundress, a position of real responsibility and some status, managed an enormous quantity of smocks, partlets, and other intimate garments that were rotated through the wardrobe in a constant cycle of use, washing, drying, and pressing. The irons used for this pressing were heated in the fire and required skill to apply without scorching the fine fabrics, and the women who performed this work were part of a domestic labour chain that stretched from the bedchamber to the laundry rooms below stairs and back again every morning. The herbs and aromatics that filled the bedchamber were not decoration. They were technology. Bundles of lavender, rosemary, and dried flowers were placed throughout the room and among the linens in the press because they genuinely inhibited some of the insect activity that plagued even the finest households, and because they masked the ambient smells of a room that, however well managed, housed a human body through the long-sealed hours of an English night. The rushes on the floor, strewn with sweet-smelling herbs like meadowsweet and chamomile, were a standard feature of interior management throughout this period, though in the grandest rooms they were increasingly replaced by woven carpets, and their regular replacement was a housekeeping task with real meaning. Old rushes that had absorbed too much of the room's daily life becoming a source of smell and potentially of disease. New rushes bringing the brief, sharp freshness of the outdoors inside. Pay attention to this next detail because it explains something about the distribution of power in the bedchamber that is easy to miss. The gentlewomen who served in that room had significant physical labour attached to their ostensibly decorative roles. They carried water, they moved furniture. They lifted and supported the layered weight of the Queen's formal gowns, which, by the later years of the reign, had become architectural constructions involving stiffened bodices, farthingale structures of wire or whalebone that extended the skirts horizontally to a width that required management when moving through doorways, and trains that needed to be held and directed by someone walking behind. Getting Elizabeth dressed was a cooperative physical project that could take an hour or more, depending on the occasion, and every pin, every lace, every adjustment was the responsibility of the women present. A pin placed incorrectly that later worked loose in public was a failure that would be noted. A gown that did not hang correctly when the Queen stood before a foreign delegation reflected on the competence of everyone who had touched it that morning. The food that arrived in the bedchamber, which it did before any public appearance, was its own theatre of protocol and risk management. Tasting was not merely ceremonial in an era when poisoning was a genuine and not paranoid concern. The elaborate rituals around the handling of royal food, the official who touched the bread, the official who tasted the drink, the order in which dishes were presented and removed reflected a real set of anxieties about a queen who had survived enough political violence to take the possibility of assassination seriously. Elizabeth's actual eating habits, once the food arrived and the ceremonies were done, were reportedly spare compared to the lavish tables she maintained for her court. She was described by several attendants as eating lightly, picking at dishes rather than consuming them with the appetite that characterized some of her male contemporaries and predecessors. She drank ale, the standard beverage of the period when water was correctly distrusted, and later in life added beer and small quantities of wine to her morning routine. She was fond of sweet things, as already noted, to consequences already described. The chamber pot, which no account of the bedchamber can honestly omit, was an object of both practical necessity and ceremonial weight. In a palace without plumbing, the management of bodily waste was a domestic problem solved by ceramic or metal vessels that were kept in specific locations in the bedchamber and the smaller closet adjoining it, and that were emptied and cleaned by servants whose role in the hierarchy was specifically tied to this task. The groom of the stool, the court official whose title sounds absurd to modern ears, was in Elizabethan terms an enormously prestigious position, held in the male courts of Henry VIII by men of significant family because it guaranteed physical proximity to the monarch at the most vulnerable moment of the day. In Elizabeth's female court, equivalent functions were managed by senior gentlewomen, and the management of that proximity carried the same political weight in a softer key. What the groom of the stool and the equivalent bedchamber women knew, simply by being present, was information that nobody outside that room possessed. And information in a court is never merely information. It is leverage, alliance, and protection. The sleeping itself was more managed than the word suggests. Elizabeth was known for irregular sleep, for waking in the night, for the anxiety that accompanied the pressures of sole rule, and that several of her attendants noted in their accounts with a care that suggests they understood they were documenting something significant. The long reign from 1558 to 1603 was not a peaceful, continuous achievement. It was a series of crises managed under conditions of sustained uncertainty, and the body of the woman managing those crises bore the evidence. Hair falling out, teeth deteriorating, sleep disrupted, aging visible and then invisible under the increasing weight of white lead that covered it. These are not the footnotes to Elizabeth's story. They are part of its center, the physical reality behind the symbolic performance. The women who saw that reality formed a group that was paradoxically both intimate and disposable. Intimate because they knew things about the Queen's body that no official portrait or state document recorded. Disposable because the court had a way of absorbing the witnesses to private truths into a professional silence that was part of their contract. Most of what we know from the bedchamber comes from letters, from foreign observers who gathered second-hand accounts, from diarists who recorded what they heard from women who had served and then left service, and from the occasional account that surfaced in the margins of other documents. The women themselves understood that what they saw in that room was not entirely theirs to tell. And yet they told it in fragments, in hints, in the kind of detail that accumulates over time into something remarkably clear. What they revealed, collectively and across the decades of the reign, is not a monster and not a saint, but a human being managing an extraordinary set of pressures with a combination of intelligence, vanity, political genius, physical discomfort, and the particular kind of loneliness that comes from occupying a position nobody else has ever occupied in quite the same way. The image of Elizabeth as the Virgin Queen, the Gloriana of the masks and the portraits, the cool, iconic figure whose personal life was an absence rather than a presence, is the image the court built and maintained at enormous collective effort. The image that emerges from the bedchamber is a woman who had bad teeth and wore a wig and sometimes could not sleep, who needed help with her pins and whose face took an hour to construct in the mornings, who ate less than people thought and worried more than she ever admitted, and who ran one of the most complex political operations in Europe from a room that smelled of lavender and ash and, underneath all of it, the particular human smell that no ceremony has ever fully managed to erase. The women who woke before dawn to prepare that room, who drew back the curtains in the correct order, who applied the white lead and managed the wigs and held the gowns in place while the pins were set, were not passive witnesses to power. They were the infrastructure of it. Without their labor, performed invisibly and with precision, the Queen who met the ambassadors and signed the documents and played the long political chess games of the reign could not have been assembled each morning. Power in this period, as in most others, depended on an invisible scaffolding of female work that the official records consistently failed to name, and that only the bedchamber's own witnesses, leaking their small truths into letters and conversations across the decades, had the information to describe. The reign of Elizabeth the Maids lasted 44 years, from 1558 until her death in March of 1603 at Richmond Palace. In those 44 years, thousands of mornings began in the way described here, with the curtains drawn back and the candles lit, and the women waiting in the half-dark with their pins and their preparations. Each of those mornings produced the Queen that England saw. Each of them also produced the woman that almost nobody was allowed to see, the one whose habits and needs and physical realities her attendants carried with them long after the reign was over, into old age and into the margins of history, where they left enough behind to let us, finally, look.